Welcome to Mac Power Users. I'm David Sparks and joined as always by my friend and yours, Mr. Stephen Hackett. Hey, Stephen.
Hello, David. How are you?
I am good, although I have a little bit of a cold, so excuse the sound of my voice. I'm going to be hitting that cough button once in a while. But we are very pleased to have a guest back. We haven't had in a long time on the show. Welcome back to the show. Marco Arment, how you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me back. It's good to be here.
Yeah. Marco, you've been a busy guy. And we have a lot to talk to you about. But before, we've got a couple preliminary announcements.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think people may have noticed that Relay, we just celebrated our 10th anniversary, and that's awesome. Thank you all for listening and supporting, etc. But I wanted to point you in direction of a video that a friend of ours made during our live show in London, where he spoke to Mike and I and a bunch of our hosts who were in town. And it's just this incredible video. Ian really killed it. And so we were trying to get some eyeballs pointed his way. And check out his whole channel. Ian does a lot of cool stuff. He's been a friend of ours for a long time. By the time this episode goes up, there will also be on his channel a long form interview with Mike and I about 10 years of Relay and having a podcast network that long. And I think it turned out really nice. And go check that out.
Also today on More Power Users, which is the ad-free extended version of the show, we're going to talk to Marco about Apple Intelligence. Marco is a power user, but also a developer. And I want to pick your brain a bit, Marco, about what you think about what Apple's doing. So let's get started, though, with just catching up. Marco, it's been a long time. I know you're legendary for a guy who just uses the same equipment for decades. So you probably haven't changed anything, right?
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, I'm still using the same types of things. Still very much a Mac person. My core devices are always my Mac and my iPhone. I've occasionally involved an iPad in my life. I currently don't have an iPad that I use. I attempted, like we all did this spring, to integrate the Vision Pro into my life. I have not succeeded at that either. So I'm really just a Mac and iPhone person. I use them both very heavily. If I could only have two, I would have the Mac and the iPhone. I have the Apple Watch too, but that's kind of an accessory.
Last time you were on, I think you were on desktop Macs, but I'm not sure. I think because you were really into the iMac for a while, the iMac Pro, I remember.
Oh, yeah. Well, because for a long time, the iMac 27-inch was the only way to get a 5K Retina screen on your desktop.
Yeah.
And then, of course, later on, we got more options. The iMac Pro was amazing. I used that for a very long time. And then ever since the Apple Silicon switch, I've switched to using a powerful laptop connected to a Pro Display XDR as my desktop. So right now, it is a 16-inch MacBook Pro M3 generation, and it stays in clamshell mode in a cool little wood vertical stand over off to the side. And so I have just the big XDR in front of me, and then of course external peripherals. And I love this setup because, and also just for around the house and for much travel, I also have a 13-inch MacBook Air, the last year's version. And what I like about this setup is that when I'm just doing stuff around the house, I can use the MacBook Air. I don't have to disconnect my whole big MacBook Pro from my desktop setup, and then I lose all my window positions and everything else. I don't have to go through all those hoops. But if I'm going on a trip where I expect to get decent amount of work done on things that require a bigger screen, like for instance, when I'm going to WWDC every summer, I know I'm going to be recording podcasts, doing editing, using Xcode, and for those types of trips, I want the biggest screen and the fastest laptop I can get. So when I'm going on a compute-heavy trip, I can bring the one I use as a desktop, and it's a laptop again. And I have all my files on it. Everything is set up. All my, big apps like, Photoshop and Lightroom and everything is all on that computer. And so I have the big, awesome travel powerhouse when I need it.
Yeah.
But for the rest of my life, when I'm just taking little day visits here and there or doing stuff around the house, I have that little MacBook Air as a lighter option. So it's a great setup, honestly. And in the past, the process of using a MacBook or a MacBook Pro as a desktop, especially in clamshell mode, in the past, that was fairly buggy and had some weird downsides. There were some heat management issues with certain generations. And ever since Apple Silicon, that has been rock solid. It is amazing. The chips run a lot cooler, so there's a lot fewer thermal issues. I never hear the fan run. And just the entire architecture seems to be much more reliable when using external monitors. So I have found this to be not only no worse than desktop Macs, but for my purposes and for what I prioritize, actually better than any desktop Apple has sold since the transition.
Yeah, and the only downside, because I do think you're right, like all of the connection stuff, it used to be like you connected it and crossed your fingers and hoped it worked, but now it's just like rock solid. But there is an input output issue. I mean, how do you deal with the fewer number of ports, or do you use fewer ports anyway? I don't know what your port situation is.
I don't use a ton right now. I'm actually not using a hub except for the built-in port splitter on the XDR. So I'm using all the XDR's ports on the back of it. Like it has its own USB-C ports on the back. I'm using all those, and then I use 2 ports on the laptop. One is going through a ridiculous chain of adapters to use a Thunderbolt Ethernet adapter, and the other one is the cable that goes to the XDR. And then that's it. And then because of the way I have it vertically in a stand, facing me on the front of it is the laptop's right side. So facing me is HDMI, which I don't use, one USB-C port, and the card reader. So I have like front access to the card reader and one port, and that's all I ever really need. So it's fine. But I have one of those Thunderbolt hubs from, I think, CalDigit. I have it in my cabinet back there. Like I will occasionally break that out to do something, but I usually don't need to.
Yeah, I had a similar situation for a while, and I switched over to a Mac Studio just because I just never took the MacBook Pro out. It was like for like a year, it just never left the dock, and I decided I'll just go with what it is. But I always wonder if that's the right decision or not. Stephen has kind of gone your direction with it, and I don't think there's really a wrong answer here, but it is nice that you have that option now to use a powerful laptop as a desktop Mac, and also even like battery management's got better. It used to be like if you did that, you killed the battery, but now Apple's got built-in logic to kind of hopefully preserve the battery longer. There's just not a lot of downside to doing what you guys are doing.
Yeah, compared to the Mac Studio option, when they first introduced the Mac Studio, that first model, remember, it had some fairly high fan noise for what it was.
Yep.
And I know they fixed that in the M2 generation, but at first it was kind of odd that they seemed to make a really great desktop in most other ways, and then it had that weird issue. But that's been fixed. But I think one issue that will persist for the foreseeable future, I think, is that it seems like Apple waits to update the Mac Studio until they can make the big chip, the Ultra chip. And because of the way these big chips are made and the expense and the yield issues and things like that, it seems like that is often going to lag behind the MacBook Pro release cycle. And in some cases, like what we see currently in the M3 generation, it seems like they're skipping this generation for the Mac Studio. So the Mac Studio seems like it's going to come in and out of like whether it's a great option. It'll depend on how recently has it been updated. And a lot of times the MacBook Pro will actually be ahead of it in certain ways. So it kind of depends on like when you're buying.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to a degree. I know on a recent ATP episode in the member section, y'all were breaking down a report about how many Macs are sold in each category, and like the MacBook Pro, laptops in general, way out ahead of desktops. And I think when Apple thinks about the Mac, it's the MacBook Pro and the MacBook Air, and the rest of it are, important to small groups of their consumers, with certain use cases, but I mean, when I think about the Apple Silicon transition, it's like the MacBooks are the clear winner. You mentioned the MacBook Air, that M2, M3, that new style, that new design is so nice. And I don't have a ton of experience with the bigger one, the 15-inch, but we've heard from listeners, and I'm sure you have too, people who have them really like them. And I set one up for somebody a while back, and we're just using it for a couple of days, kind of getting their stuff transferred over. And even in that short use case, like this is nice. Like it's been a long time since Apple has sold a consumer notebook bigger than 13 inches. And I like that they're trying things again in those arenas, separating the Air from the Pro in some meaningful ways, because none of that stuff happened for a long time. And I'm just so pleased that, like, yeah, I can use a MacBook Pro as my only computer. I do the same thing you do, have it with a display and a bunch of stuff, and it's rock solid. Like none of the weirdness you used to get with the Intel Macs has carried into the new era.
Yeah, which is great because, like, I did that for a while, but now I have no patience for unreliability in my tools.
Mhm.
Like I'm 42. I'm established in my field. I have a budget now, so I'm like, if anything is going to be unreliable, it is dead to me. Like I will not tolerate it. And so I wouldn't be using this setup and I've been using it now for I think 3 years, 4 years. I wouldn't be doing this if it was unreliable, and it really is just rock solid.
Which build did you get for your MacBook Pro?
I have the max of, I think I spec'd it out in almost every way to the max, because this is like, again, this is my workstation. So
Sure.
I don't think I went all the way up on the RAM, but I have everything else pretty maxed out.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. I mean, you're doing development work and you do production work because you've got, all the stuff you're doing with the podcast and your other endeavors.
And the thing too is, like, in the past, if you would take like the old 15-inch MacBook Pro in the Intel era, if you would spec it up and get like the top CPU and everything else, it would be a noticeably worse product in certain ways. It would be hot as heck all the time. The battery life would be awful. Like it would be a much worse product than the low spec versions. And now in the Apple Silicon era, that's not the case. Like the chip, largely is much more controlled thermally. Everything else is much better managed as well. And so like you can spec it up, and it's still like, I almost feel like I'm getting away with something. Like it's still this amazing machine for like long-term use on battery if I need to. It's never too hot. It never gets loud. And yet, like, it's the top spec thing that's like outperforming many desktops. And it's a pretty great time for the Mac right now.
Yeah, I mean, there was really a heat in battery tax for getting a spec'd up MacBook Pro in the Intel era.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, those GPUs were just murder for a long time. I mean, I think, Marco, you and I probably talked about it on a show at some point in that era, but both of us were like, yeah, the best one is the entry-level 15 with the integrated graphics. Like, unless you need the discrete graphics, the integrated, like, you get incredible battery life. You avoid a lot of the heat and noise issues. And you're totally right. There's something about these Apple Silicon notebooks in particular that feel like they're breaking the rules somehow. It's like, wait, it's this powerful. It can do these many things and this fast, but it's in everyday use completely silent. Like it doesn't make sense sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, the combination of these amazing, Apple Silicon era, plus just as you were mentioning, I have the M2 MacBook Air, that generation, but the M3 is the same basically. The greatness of this new MacBook Air is part of the reason why I don't currently use an iPad, because the MacBook Air is so good for my purposes. For my purposes, it's way better than an iPad, because there's a lot of things that frustrate me about using the iPad for my work, or that the iPad literally can't do for my work. So the Mac covers it all for me. I can do whatever I need to on a Mac. And the new MacBook Airs are just so good in so many ways that every time I use one of those to get something done, like on the go, I'm very happy I have it. Whereas the iPad, I'm always wishing I had a Mac. So the MacBook Air has gotten so good that it has removed really any role the iPad would have had in my life.
Yeah, it did really kind of suck up some of the iPad oxygen, all day battery, thin and light, all the Apple Silicon benefits are there, except of course the cellular radio, which hopefully we get at some point. I don't know.
I really want that so badly.
Yeah.
This current MacBook Air that I have is so good. I don't think I would be motivated to replace it anytime soon unless it breaks, except if they would add cellular. I would, whenever they do that, if they ever do, even if my laptop is like 2 months old, I'll replace it just for cellular. It would be that big of a difference.
It'd be huge.
I'm still using the 13, but I've never actually used the 15 outside of just like, handling it quickly in an Apple store. Next time I do have to replace it, I'm going to consider it for sure, because I do love screen space. But at the same time, like, this is my thin and light laptop, and I'm very glad they have the 13.
And then on the iPhone, I believe you were a small iPhone guy, but is that still the case?
When they had the Mini, I did indeed enjoy that. They did 2 years of the Mini. I used the first one, the iPhone 12 Mini.
Yeah.
But the 13 got me back on the Pro with some of the camera improvements and things like that. So I've been on the small Pro side for most of the time that the Pro has existed. So I'm still on the small Pro, and I think I will probably stay here for the foreseeable future, unless the rumors are that this new iPhone Slim model might exist at some point soon. We'll see what that is. That is interesting to me. So maybe I would try that, but I think otherwise I'll be sticking with the small Pro.
Yeah, I wish they kept making the mini. It's not really for me, but I know a lot of people that really love that phone.
It was honestly, it was great. I think, unfortunately, I think I might not do it today simply because in the time, in the last 3 years since the iPhone Mini, since my iPhone Mini usage, my close-up vision has gotten a little bit worse as I've gotten older. So now I need like reading glasses for close-up things, and I think the Mini would be just below my threshold of comfort for everyday use. So I think I'm going to
Well,
stick with the big one now, regardless.
memento mori, Marco. Memento mori.
Yeah. Marco, I know over the years, the two different size Pro phones have had slightly different camera features, right? This is a cycle that we're currently in where that's true, where you get the fancy zoom on the larger one. How do you feel about that trade-off? Like, is that frustrating to you as somebody I know who like you value photography in your iPhone, or is the size so important to you that you're willing to kind of let the other stuff go?
I mean, obviously, I would always prefer if I can get the better camera in the size phone I want. But the size is more important to me if I have to pick like a size that is comfortable for me to hold and to be sitting in my pocket all day versus like, having the best cameras in the world. Like I'll take the size if I really have to make that choice. I mean, fortunately, many years we don't have to make that choice. And of course, the current rumors are that the iPhone's coming out this fall, that the 5X lens is allegedly going to come to the smaller Pro, which I'm looking forward to that if that's true. But for me, like the further zoomed in lenses, I am not usually a big fan of the picture quality that you get from those because they usually have to have compromised optics and sensors in order to reach those longer lengths with the same physical dimensions, as the other lenses. And so usually the picture quality is noticeably worse on the 2X or the 3X or the 5X, whatever that other camera is. And even the 0.5X, like the picture quality is almost always significantly compromised. And so I find this to be the case with my current one with the 3X lens. I find that the 3X for me is more of a utility lens. It's like if I want to like remember what the parking sign says, it's nice to zoom in and see that more easily or whatever. But it's not, I don't use it so much as like an artistic thing. And so the difference between 3X and 5X for my purposes is not big. The 5X would have more utility in the same way that, that I use a 3X for utility purposes. But in the meantime, if I can't have the 5X, it's not the end of the world. And so I will, every time I'll pick the phone that is the right size for me if I have that option.
I would love to talk to someone at Apple about that. Why is it always that the secondary lenses just are of inferior quality? I mean, is there a practical reason for that, or is it just cost?
I think it's both. I mean, I think ultimately though it's a matter of physics that if you look at, look at full size camera gear and you see like, what does it take to have like an f1.4 lens at a smaller focal distance, like a 50 millimeter f1.4, that's one size. And then you're like, okay, now give me a 200 millimeter f1.4. You're like, whoa, hold on. That's first of all, I don't even know if that exists, but it's like if it did, it would be massive. And so I think that's the problem when you're dealing with these different focal lengths. Like, the shorter focal lengths are easier to make big, wide open lenses and have a big sensor behind it because the light doesn't have very far it needs to go for that focal length. Whereas if you have a bigger one, like, currently the 5X lens on the Pro Max, they had to do kind of a prism setup to like bend the optics around a certain way to give it enough space to even expand the light out or whatever it has to do in there. So there's a lot more trickery involved in getting, a lot of light into a big lens onto a big sensor when you start having zoomed in focal lengths. And I think a lot of times physics just get in the way and you can't do it.
This episode of the Mac Power Users is brought to you by 1Password. Go to 1password.com/MP right now to get 20% off and get more productive and more secure. 1Password is so much more than just a password manager. It brings you security and productivity wrapped up all into one. With 1Password, you can secure every sign-in, store all sign-ins in secure vaults with the ability to securely share passwords, secrets, and more. You can even share passwords with people who are not 1Password subscribers. They have figured out all the angles to make it easy for you to securely sign in everywhere. And those sign-ins can apply to every application. You can manage access to every application and web account for every member of your account. I've got a family account, and we do that with our kids, and it's really built in great security habits for them. And they've got all the platforms covered, whether you're on the web, your iPad, your iPhone, your Mac. They've got clients for all the big platforms, so you can share your passwords across multiple platforms. One of my favorite things about 1Password is the way that their products scale. You could just get an individual plan just for yourself, or you could get a family plan to cover the whole family, but you could also get it to cover your business or enterprise company. They've got a product for everybody in that spectrum. I have a family plan, and I'm very happy with it because not only do we get all of that secure sign-in privileges and the ability to share between each other, we also get those additional features that 1Password has, like secure cloud storage, the ability to have secure notes, which I use all the time. And like I said, sharing with outsiders. Like one of the things I do is for my family members that are not on the family plan, like my sisters and kind of extended family, for whom I do IT work, essentially. I manage their networks for them. I always write down their passwords because they always lose them. But I've got those in secure 1Password notes, so they're very protected on my devices. And when they inevitably ask me for their own passwords, I send them with 1Password secure sharing, so they're protected. In fact, over the years, I've converted quite a few of them to 1Password, doing just that. So check out 1Password, and if you're already using it, share it with a friend or family. I feel like you can really do people a favor getting them on a good, safe, and secure password platform like 1Password, especially today with all the shenanigans going on out there on the internet. So it's 1password.com/MPU to get that 20% off. That works for yourself and your friends and family. Go check it out today. Let them know you heard about it here on the Mac Power Users. And thanks again, 1Password, for all of your support of the Mac Power Users.
So, Marco, you recently launched a new version of Overcast, which is your podcast client, primarily for iOS, but it also on the iPad and the Mac and the Vision Pro through various compatibility systems, which I think we'll talk about in a little while. First of all, congratulations on the launch. 10 years is incredible. Having this rewrite out to land on that date seems like magic to me. But I wanted to go back a little bit before we get to the new version. Launching in the summer of 2014, like I remember that very well. We were building Relay. We were talking about that behind the scenes. And I really remember with Overcast initially, there was, it seemed to me like a push to keep podcasting open, right? And that's something that like comes in cycles where big media players come in and try to change things. And, folks like the three of us who want podcasting to remain on RSS feeds that you can upload to any server and download to any client or any app you want. We believe that's the way it should be. And I think you've been successful in that. And I know just from Relay's own stats, Overcast has never been more popular amongst our listeners. Most of our shows, it's the biggest single podcast client in use, which is incredible, really cool. And I just wonder, now 10 years later, how do you think about that original kind of pitch and idea? And do you think that was successful? How do you think that's gone over the last decade?
I mean, it's the longest job I've ever had, with the exception of ATP. It has actually worked out very well. But it's, back then, the environment was so different in certain ways, and yet podcasting is very resilient to change or to change attempts. And so in many ways, things work the same way now that they did back then 10 years ago, but the environment around them is so different. So, back in 2014, for me to launch a podcast app actually felt like a pretty big risk, because back then, keep in mind, this was before Serial, the hit podcast Serial, before that. And the podcast market, we had This American Life, we had tech shows, we had some other public radio types of shows. Comedians were just starting, to get a little bit big there, but for the most part, it was still considered a fairly narrow appeal medium. Like even back in 2014, you would still have to often explain to people what podcasts were, or they might have heard of them, but they would never have actually heard one, or even know how to hear them. So podcasts back then were a lot less mainstream than they are today. And As a result, the market was still pretty small. The app market was still much healthier because there were not a lot of big players in it. And the big players that were in it, partially haven't changed in the sense that it was mostly, still mostly Apple back then, and it still is mostly Apple today.
Yeah.
With Apple Podcasts. But that was before Spotify had podcasts. That was in the meantime, everyone has added podcasts to their apps. Everybody who makes audio or music services has added podcasts as a thing to their apps. Even video services have now, like YouTube is now, like Google Podcasts is gone. They've funneled it into YouTube podcasts. Like now, every big service has podcasts. Also, back then, there was hardly any service exclusive content in podcasting. Almost all podcasts back then were free and available for every podcast player. Today, that's also very different. There's now every one of those big platforms tries to get exclusives. Whether it's through just the creators not knowing any better, like people who put up videos on YouTube and call them podcasts and say, "All right, I have a podcast," and they don't even know necessarily how to get it into the other podcast players, or down to people who are actually signing up exclusive deals. Like, Spotify had a lot of exclusives famously for a while. Many of them are not exclusive now, but that's still a thing that happens. Apple Podcasts has now also added their integrated payment thing where you can like pay for premium podcasts that only work on Apple Podcasts. So like there has been a lot of change in the podcast market since then, that it actually now is getting much further siloed, I would say. Back then the only real players were Apple, a bunch of indie apps of which I was joining the ranks, and a couple of big ones like Stitcher and iHeartRadio. But like at the time, Stitcher was the one that actually scared me the most, because like as a podcaster and as a podcast fan, because Stitcher at the time was basically like having people agree to be there and then re-hosting and re-serving their audio, which kind of broke the open model. And they were kind of building their own walled garden. And I thought, that's not good, because if everyone gets on Stitcher and if they start getting a huge market share, they can start acting like YouTube acts, which is basically dictating how an entire medium is going to work for everyone who wants to enjoy it. And I didn't want that to happen to podcasts. And the funny thing is, in the intervening time, that has actually happened in lots of ways. That's how Spotify does all of their podcasting. I think, at least I think it is. It was when they started. That is how Google Podcasts did work for a time. That is absolutely how YouTube Podcasts works. There's a whole bunch of those kind of things now where everyone wants to create their own walled garden now. And the difference now is that they're actually working. Even Apple Podcasts, for a while, you could count on Apple Podcasts to be kind of the sleeping giant in the room. Like they had such big market share that if they weren't on board with some new standard or spec or even just like trend, it wouldn't happen in podcasting. Like if Apple wasn't on board, it just wouldn't happen, which was great because it kept podcasting simple and open, and it kept a lot of ad tech out of podcasting, which is also great. But the downside is that now Apple has woken up, and in part because Spotify started taking away a lot of market share. And the feud between Apple and Spotify, the competition between Apple and Spotify, has only heated up over time in all parts of their services. Apple Music versus Spotify's music offering. But then when Spotify started getting into podcasts very heavily, that seemed to wake up Apple Podcasts. And now Apple is doing things that I would never have guessed 5 years ago that Apple Podcasts would be doing. Things like adding that paid tier, which, by the way, Overcast can't match because of Apple's 30%.
Right,
So
right.
Even if I wanted to do that, I would be on way worse footing than Apple's would be in terms of how much I would have to charge versus how much I'd be able to pay out to people, which, by the way, is also an argument Spotify makes for their music service. But, Apple, so they have their exclusive paid content, which I don't love. Apple Podcasts also has given publishers a checkbox in their like feed management interface that will allow publishers to not have their podcast RSS feeds be published in the Apple Podcast Directory API. Now that API is how apps like mine and most other indie apps on the iPhone get our listings, our search listings. So if a podcast is publishing to Apple Podcast, in the past, we could all get it too. Every other podcast app on iOS could have that podcast show up in search results, and we would get their RSS feed URL, and we'd be able to play their episodes in our apps too, because everybody would submit to Apple because it was the biggest player, and we would kind of benefit from that. Now, Apple has given an opt-out checkbox to those feeds being available through their search API. So therefore, what people can do now is they can list a podcast for free in Apple Podcasts, but have it not show up anywhere else. I hate this because so far I have, and thank God it's off by default, but so far I've had numerous issues where a publisher will check that box like thinking it means something else maybe, or they won't really understand it, and then it'll cause support problems for both of us as their listeners bother both of us to say, why can't I find your podcast in my app or whatever? So it creates a lot of problems, and I wish they wouldn't do it. But so anyway, so all this is to say that the environment back then was way smaller of a business, and it was more open and simpler. And today, podcasting is a way bigger business. It has been attacked multiple times by people trying to lock it down and close it up for themselves and become middlemen. Many of those people have actually succeeded in certain areas, like, for instance, Spotify, which owns Megaphone, which is the biggest ad insertion and hosting platform among most of the big podcasts. And so, like, the podcast ad serving market has actually changed tremendously in the meantime. And it's all been locked up mostly all been locked up by Spotify. And so there's a lot of like weird environmental changes that have happened since then. You know, Apple Podcasts, it's now very much awake and very much doing some substantial updates. And so I think on many levels, it's way harder to be a podcast app now than it used to be, because people expect more, and there's all these other competitive forces kind of, you know, coming up to the gates and trying to you know, take over the market for themselves. But when you look at what has actually happened, there have been so many startups that have tried, and so many big companies that have tried to lock it down for themselves, and to make, like, you know, big walled gardens to become, quote, the Netflix of podcasts, which is something that we see in, you know, VC pitches about every 2 years. And they mostly haven't worked. Even Spotify, which tried to have all this exclusive content, paid a lot of money and made a lot of big deals to do it. Even they couldn't really take it over for themselves. They took a lot of market share, but they didn't take it over. And so it is harder than ever now to stay afloat in this business. And it has had more challenges than ever, you know, to its openness and to its the way it works on a technical level. But it has still survived. It is still the same largely as how it was back then in terms of how podcasts are hosted, who owns them, how they're distributed, how they're served, what kind of technical capabilities do they have, how is ad tech involved in them, how much creepiness is involved in their ad tech. Like, to a large degree, most of those questions have the same answers now that they did 10 years ago. And that's actually very comforting and very encouraging to me, because the simpler it is and the less people are able to do and the less people are able to mess it up or take it over, the more likely it is to stay the open ecosystem that it is. And, you know, if you wanted to, going back to the YouTube example, if you wanted to, like, launch a new video hosting site today to compete with YouTube, like, you just can't. Like, there is just no way that's going to work at all. If you want to launch a new podcast app today, you still can, because most of the conditions that allow that to happen are still the case. And so there still are new podcast apps launching today. You might not hear about them that much because it's in general with all apps much harder to get attention and new users today than it used to be. Usually you have to pay for it now. You didn't have to pay for it 10 years ago as much. But for the most part, you still can make a new podcast app today. And anybody can still launch a new podcast today and host it on their own site, on their own hosting, or however they want to do it. They don't have to agree to, like, YouTube's terms or anything like that. You know, all of that is kind of optional. All they have to do is list themselves in directory things like Apple Podcast Directory, and apps will find them and play them. And they can insert their own ads if they want to. Like, there's all sorts of freedoms and simplicities and open distribution avenues that still exist in this medium that largely don't exist in most other media on the web today.
Yeah, I tell people podcasting's taken a few punches, but it's still independent. And that is the big win for us. it's the reason we can still make a show, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about Overcast itself. I know you chronicled a lot of this on Under the Radar, your show with David Smith about independent iOS development over on Relay. But, 10 years is a long time. And you had sort of the timing and way and when it came out where Swift had been announced, right? But it was still very new, I think, when Overcast launched. And in the interleaving decade, you've had Swift make huge advancements. Have had Swift UI, things like Catalyst and other things have come along to further extend applications. And applications are in more places than ever, right? You've got everything from the watch to CarPlay, Vision OS having iPad apps in it. What happened in those 10 years where you kind of came to the realization of like a rewrite is what I have to do? Was it just the march of time? Was there something bigger going on there? What was that process like for you?
I mean, a lot of it was just time in the sense that, like, whenever you have a 10-year-old code base, it's going to have accumulated a lot of technical debt if you've never really gone through and aggressively paid down that technical debt. That's just what happens over time with software development. And there are certain things that add to that, artificially more than time itself would. One of those things is a language change, which, as you mentioned, like, Swift came out and really matured a lot during that time. So that's a big one right there, is like the entire programming language changed of like what we are expected to use. Now, Apple did this in a way that Swift works very well with the previous language, Objective-C. There's a lot of interoperability between them, so you don't have to rewrite your entire app in Swift on day one. You can do it piecemeal, and they can coexist indefinitely. But there's a lot of shortcomings to doing that, and a lot of more modern Swift programming styles are fairly difficult to mate with Objective-C code, or at least make it a lot more cumbersome or a lot less elegant or more risky or things like that. And so there is a lot of inertia behind, like, once you start using Swift, it's a lot easier if all the code that you're interacting with is also Swift. So there is a lot of pressure there to start rewriting Objective-C code in Swift. Also, during that time, the UI framework changed. They introduced Swift UI about 5 years ago, and that changed everything as well. So over that 10 years, I have all of the technical debt of a 10-year-old project, plus a language change, plus a UI framework introduction. Now, at first, and Swift UI, again, you can blend Swift UI with the old framework, UIKit, but again, there are shortcomings, there's complexities, there are losses of benefits, and certain things don't quite work great if you do that. So again, you have the same thing over there, where like it sure would be nice if you could rewrite most of your UI using this new framework, because then you could enjoy a lot of benefits of it and efficiencies and things like that. And so over that 10 years, I had those two massive bombs drop. Plus, I just got 10 years better as a programmer. So programmers always, we look back on our old code, even stuff I wrote 6 months ago, I'll look at it and be like, well, that's garbage. I can do that so much better now. That's a very programmer way to look at things. And so over that 10 years, I would occasionally rewrite pieces here and there using, newer techniques, new languages, new frameworks. But it was always, very piecemeal, and it was always a huge battle trying to integrate the new code and the new way to do something with the old code base and the old languages and frameworks. It was always, just huge amounts of friction trying to do that. It was possible, but just tons of friction and tons of waste. Meanwhile, also in these last 10 years, the scope of what people expect from a good iOS app has grown tremendously. You look at if a brand new app today launched in the productivity-ish space, whether it's a podcast player or something like, a notes app or something, like, think about all the different things that you might want that app to do, or that you as a customer, especially as power users, might expect that app to do. So first of all, it's probably not going to just be on iPhone. It's going to have some kind of sync backend, and it's going to be on iPhone and iPad and maybe Mac and maybe Vision Pro, maybe the Apple Watch. It's going to have to probably have widgets and other integrations, like the different platform features it's going to have to integrate with. in the near future, maybe we'll have some Apple Intelligence features. You're gonna definitely want like some intents so that it can be used with shortcuts. Like there's all these different the surface area of what you have to cover as like an app that's thought of as a decent iOS app citizen. It has just grown tremendously in 10 years. So at the same time that I was building up all this technical debt with just Overcast being written in the old language and using the old frameworks and just slowly aging up to 10 years old, in addition to all that, the demands on me for just keeping up with the platform kept going up because as the platform matures, we keep adding more of these things. Oh, now we have to have a Vision Pro app, or now we have to adopt to the new system theme or the new dark mode or whatever. Those things add up so much over time that at the same time that the demands on my time kept growing and growing, the app itself with the old code base was getting harder and harder to maintain because it would take more time to do things that should be simple. And meanwhile, I knew in the back of my head that somebody who didn't have a giant legacy code base like I had could outcompete me. Because anybody who was starting a new app today, yeah, they would have a lot more ground to cover in terms of all that huge amount of surface area that people would expect their app to have, but they would be able to do it using all the new frameworks and all the new languages and all the new techniques. And they would eventually then be able to pass me, and I'd be stuck in my old code base. And part of it was kind of like perceived competitive vulnerability there. But another part of it was I just felt like I wasn't serving my customers very well. Because so often, like the new OS of the year would come out, and there would be some new feature like widgets or whatever, and I would be behind. I wouldn't be there on day one. I wouldn't even be there on month one because it was just taking me too long to keep up with everything because my old code base was so high friction to maintain. So a combination of all those factors led me to conclude, okay, I need to rewrite this using the new stuff. And the way to do it is a total rewrite of most of the components, the entire UI and the entire like bottom end of the data layer. And so that's what I did. I rewrote everything except the audio engine. The audio engine is still the nice Overcast classic audio engine, which is actually mostly written in C, not Objective-C. But so there's the huge C audio engine that is still there. And then there is now a brand new data layer, sync layer, and UI. And it took me a long time. It took me about 18 months, during which I was not really able to add many other features to the old app. But now, I launched it about a month ago. It's had a little bit of a bumpy start just because it's a rewrite. And so I'm hitting all these little edge cases. Oh, there's a small bug there when you have this configuration, and so I got to go fix that. But for the most part, I'm able to work so much faster in this new code base. It has already improved tremendously in the last month since the first release. And I'm moving at lightning speed now. So it was a huge amount of work. It was a huge undertaking. I probably, if I had to actually quantify like how many hours I took doing it, it probably wouldn't have been worth it in any kind of financial sense. But I'm incredibly glad I did it because now I can actually move with the times. I can keep up with what I need to keep up with. I can serve my customers a lot better. I can compete a lot better in the market. And the resulting app is just better. It's way faster. It's way more reliable. My crash rate has gone down by more than half. It is just way, way better in so many ways. Uses way less memory. It stays in memory longer as a result on your phone, so it launches faster. Like there's just so many advantages to it. So it's been a long time coming, but I'm very glad to finally be here.
This episode of MPU is brought to you by NetSuite. Let's do some quick math. The less your business spends on operations and multiple systems and delivering your product or service, the more margin you have and the more money you get to keep. But with higher expenses on materials, employees, distribution, and borrowing, everything costs more. So to reduce cost and headaches, smart businesses are graduating to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, and HR into one platform and one source of truth. With NetSuite, you can reduce IT costs because NetSuite lives in the cloud with no hardware required, and it can be accessed from anywhere. So you cut the cost of maintaining multiple systems because you've got one unified business management suite. You can improve efficiency by bringing all of your major business processes into one platform, slashing manual tasks and errors. Over 37,000 companies have already made the move. So do the math and see how you'll profit with NetSuite. It's super important to find ways to cut costs and boost business performance. And that thing about slashing manual tasks and errors is a real deal. I know the course of the last 10 years of my business, and we've had times where we're doing double entry or like taking data from one system into another. Mistakes happen. No one means to make them, of course, but it does. And so if you can automate those things, you can keep things in one unified system, you'll be much better off. By popular demand, NetSuite has extended its one-of-a-kind flexible financing program for a few more weeks. Head on over to netsuite.com/MPU to learn more. That's NetSuite, NETSUITE. netsuite.com/MPU. Our thanks to NetSuite for the support of the show and all of Relay. Anytime you have a big rewrite like that, which includes a substantial amount of design work, I'm sure people will be upset about a feature that got dropped or something that got changed. How do you handle that? I mean, I know when you launch an app update like this, there's a lot of excitement. You know, you've been working on it, people have seen it, but you're putting it into the world with tons of users for the first time, and sometimes some of those people don't like it. How do you manage that feedback? How do you decide what's something that you need to address versus something that you believe is the right change or the right move? And, you know, maybe there'll be some pain temporarily. Like, what does all that decision making look like?
It's definitely an evolving process. I don't have all the answers to that. You know, part of the challenge of maintaining an iOS app over time is that when you're building on iOS, you're building on quicksand. The environment around you is constantly changing, constantly evolving, you know, both on technical levels and also just in trends and styles. An iOS app that was considered like a good design or like a modern app citizen 10 years ago looks very different than what would be considered a good design and a modern app citizen today.
Mm-hmm.
So over time, you have to keep changing. You have to change with the times and with the styles as you maintain an app over time. And of course, that's not always popular with certain people. So any change you make, even if the functionality is the same, any change you make to a design, to a style, to interaction is going to rub some people the wrong way. So it's very difficult over time to try to maintain user satisfaction, like try to please everybody basically over time, because if you don't ever change your design or your interactions or whatever, then your app will look very old and you'll have trouble attracting new users. And many of your current users will jump ship because they see newer apps and they're like, this one looks nicer or whatever. And so leaving it the same, leaving it like, you know, old forever is not a good strategy. Like your business will slowly rot and die if you do that. But every time you change it, you incur a lot of negative feedback. So it's very difficult to know whether a change you've made is actually a good one or not for a while. Like sometimes you got to kind of sit with it for a while. I don't always guess correctly. Sometimes, you know, I've been lucky. I've done a couple of redesigns over the history of Overcast, and usually they've gone pretty well. But one of the downsides of my slowing down of the updates over time as my aforementioned tech debt accumulated, is that the rate at which I did redesign slowed down over time too. So right now, like the one I just launched, it's been a while since the last one. It's been, I think, at least 3 years. It's been a while. People had gotten so accustomed to the old design that I feel like the backlash against the new one was stronger than it would have been if I was still tweaking the design every year or two, like I used to. So that's part of it. Part of it is that I combined this rewrite with a couple of feature removals, mostly small, one big one, which is streaming, which I am actually reversing that decision. You guys can break the news if you want. Streaming will be back in the next update. That's what I've been working on the last few days, because I thought I could get away without it, and I thought it would make a lot of things simpler. And the fact is it would. It would make a lot of things simpler if I didn't have to support streaming. That on technical levels, on user experience levels, on bug levels, it is so much better if I can not have streaming in the app. The problem is that just way too many people were affected by that removal. I had analytics on it in the old app, and it seemed like a small percentage of the user base who would actually use streaming by default. What I didn't realize was how many people use streaming sometimes. And that's a way bigger number than the ones who use it by default. So I was undercounting those people in the analytics. And so the total net damage to the app for a lot of people was bigger than I thought by removing streaming. So that's going to come back in a more limited fashion. Basically, it's going to work the way it used to if you start from the beginning, and it's not going to have the capability to like seek ahead way into the file and restart the download, just downloading that last part. Like it's gonna start at the beginning and download the whole thing. But if you're playing it from the beginning, it will start playing immediately.
Okay.
If the download fails, it will stop and kick you out, and you'll have to start over. And the reason why is not because I'm trying to punish you; it's because dynamic ad insertion breaks that ability. So I've redone it in a way now that is simpler, has a few fewer features in terms of the how dynamically it can stream things, but it should work way better for way more people this way. And it's done in a way now that is compatible with dynamic ad insertion at the expense of if your connection drops and the download drops halfway through, it won't resume it. It can't. So there's a couple of limitations there, but it's overall, having used it these last few days in testing, overall it is way more convenient to have it than to not have it. So anyway, all that is to say, streaming is coming back in the next version. There are, when I look at decisions I've made in this, there are certain things that you just have to kind of get out there and see how people like them.
Mm-hmm.
That's how my entire development pattern has always gone. I try things on myself for a while before I release them. If I like it, or if I think it's the right move, I ship it. So I might do a beta in the middle there, but for the most part, betas are usually pretty short for me, usually just finding bugs. And then I ship it and see what people say. And most of the time, I think my hit rate's been pretty good. And sometimes when I make the wrong choice, like removing streaming, then I go back and I fix it. That's how you got to be. The idea of staying the same forever is untenable on iOS, as mentioned. So you gotta be willing and able to change on a regular basis, no matter what. And you have to do with a little bit more, I would say, care and measurement when you have an existing user base compared to when you're starting from scratch. Like if I was starting from scratch, I would probably do things pretty differently in a lot of different ways.
Right.
But I'm not. I have an existing user base that I care very much about and I want to maintain, and so I take that very seriously. So overall, like the way I make decisions now is a lot more data based than it used to be in terms of like I will actually try to look and see how many people am I going to disrupt if I change this thing. But I'm also still, at the end of the day, I'm still me, and I'm still going to make the decisions I think are right. I'll just try to bring people along as best as I can.
I can tell you one bit of feedback from me is that once I saw you had switched to Swift UI, I felt like more assurance that this is the app I'll continue to be using in the future, because that's a big deal. I mean, that's the future. That all future kind of features like widgets and things are going to reward developers like you who have made this sacrifice. And it is a sacrifice. I mean, you kind of took a beating in terms to get this thing done. Omni Group went through the same thing. But, once you guys get to the other side of that, then suddenly it's so easy to add new features. And as users, we know that we're going to get all the shiny bells and whistles in your app. So thanks for doing that. I know it wasn't easy.
Well, and the great thing, Swift UI, you do kind of start out slowly. Like I've compared it to like trying to start a car in fifth gear. Like you can do it. It's just going to be a very slow process, and it's going to be a while before you build up any speed. But once you do build up speed, it's incredible. So once you have your app architected to use Swift UI well, and once you have enough experience using Swift UI as a developer to be able to wield it well, you can do things with amazing speed. And where this benefits users, not only can your apps, do more in terms of like they can develop more and have more screens and more capabilities more easily, but also what I've found amazingly valuable about it is that it speeds up design iteration. So I'm able to try out a design idea on a screen and say, hey, I wonder what happens if I maybe move this over here and restructure this to be like this. I can try that in an afternoon. And I can try 4 different versions of that in an afternoon. And if one of them ends up being great, I can get it out there real fast. If something that I made ends up not being that great, I can throw it away because I don't feel bad because I didn't spend that much time on it. So what ends up happening is not only do I save time in development, but also the designs end up being better. That what ends up being in the app has been iterated on more. I'm more willing to iterate on them because it is faster and cheaper to do it. And when things don't work, I'm less tied to it. And so I can say, you know what, this design, I tried it, didn't work for people for whatever reason, and so I'll try something else. And I'm able to ship way better software way faster as a result of that because I've been able to have that faster iteration process.
This episode of the Mac Power Users is brought to you by ZocDoc. Go to ZocDoc.com/MPU to find the right doctor right now. Sometimes searching for the right doctor is like a bad Mad Libs. You need a blank specialist who takes your blank insurance, who is within blank miles of you. Well, ZocDoc makes it easy to fill in those blanks to help you find the right doctor for your specific needs. ZocDoc is a free app and website where you can search and compare high-quality in-network doctors, choose the right one for your needs, and click instantly to book an appointment. We're talking about in-network appointments with more than 100,000 healthcare providers across every specialty, from mental health to dental health, eye care to skin care, and much more. You can also see their actual appointment openings, choose a time that works for you, click and instantly book a visit. Plus, ZocDoc appointments happen fast, typically within 24 to 72 hours of booking. You can even score same-day appointments. I'm one of the millions of ZocDoc users, and it was so easy to start using ZocDoc because it really fixes a problem a lot of us deal with. When you get sick or someone in your household gets sick, you don't want to spend a lot of time searching for doctors, and it is a lot of time. You've got to sit on hold, you got to make sure they actually take your insurance, and then it seems like kind of a shot in the dark anyway. With ZocDoc, you solve all those problems. You can book it right from the app. You can look at patient reviews to make sure it's a quality doctor, and you know definitively if they take your insurance. All of that is solved just by downloading ZocDoc. So stop putting off those doctor appointments and go to ZocDoc.com/MPU to find and instantly book top-rated doctors today. That's ZocDoc.com/MPU. ZocDoc.com/MPU. And our thanks to ZocDoc for sponsoring the Mac Power Users and Olive Relay.
So, Marco, you have been a developer on the iPhone and iPad for a long time. Instapaper was there very early in 2008. Anytime I go back, you do the thing sometimes, it shows up on social media of like, what are the first 10 apps you downloaded on your iPhone, right? Like your stuff's in there early on, which is really cool. And the iPhone has always been on more or less an annual release cycle. They sort of shifted it from the summer to the fall one year, but each year we get a new version of iOS and a new version of iPadOS and watchOS, and the Mac has even moved to that, as of like the Mountain Lion era, kind of the way things have been for a long time. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that, both from the user perspective, but in particular the development and developer perspective, where each fall there are new features, but they're not going to roll out to everybody because not everyone's going to update. Like, how do you approach that? Like, do you think the annual release cycle still makes sense now, many years into it?
I think that it used to be a lot bumpier. When they first started doing it, the iPhone has usually been a pretty reliable platform. There have been a couple of bad releases, like iOS 13 was rough. but for the most part, especially recently, they've done a pretty good job of making iOS and iOS development fairly stable, and as a user too. Like most of the time, you can, even if you want to, which I don't necessarily recommend, but you can even install the early developer betas for iPhone, and usually they're pretty usable, pretty reliable, pretty stable. The iPhone release cycle, I think, therefore, has always been pretty good, with a couple of very small exceptions. The problem is when you look at the rest of Apple's business, the iPhone always gets the most attention, gets the most resources. Of course, it's their biggest business. But when they started bringing the other platforms into the annual release cycle, especially the Mac, which for a while was I think not getting enough attention and not getting enough resources, it was a much rougher ride in some of those other places. So I think for a while they had a lot of growing pains moving to that cycle. There were a lot of years, especially on the Mac, where software quality was a big problem. It was a little rough for a while there. But I think they've gotten into a good point now. In the last few years, the releases have been pretty high quality, pretty stable. The number of bugs that actually reach users has been pretty low. So overall, I think they had a rough time getting to this pattern. But now that they've established the pattern and they've had a lot of time to work out the kinks, I think it's pretty good now. As a developer, it is in some ways it can be a little rough, especially if you, like on the Mac, for instance, if your apps depend on areas of the Mac that Apple wants to continually lock down further and further. Things like certain permissions, or if you're like not in the Mac App Store, you need like certain access to read the whole disk, or you need to use the camera or microphone, or more recently we've had this dust up with some of the screen recording permissions. When your app lives in one of those areas, every release cycle is potentially threatening your entire business, and so to have them happen more frequently is much more stressful and much more impactful and risky, honestly. Over in iOS land, though, again, because iOS releases tend to be pretty safe, pretty stable, pretty high quality, that kind of like the frequency of the updates for iOS isn't usually a big problem for developers. It's not a big burden for us, and because they're on the annual cycle now, they're also very predictable. We know that there's a seasonality to Apple's year. Developers know that, like, all right, chances are in June and September we're going to be pretty busy because that's the WWDC and then the launch of the new OSs usually in September. So we know we're going to be busy then, and maybe a little bit into October depending on different hardware tweaks. If there's like new hardware on the iPhone of the year and there's a last minute API release, maybe we'll have to use that or something. But for the most part, like September, October, we're going to be a little bit busy. June is going to be a little bit busy as we dive into the new betas and stuff. But then the rest of the year, we know how it's going to go. Like, we know the summer is going to be spent probably developing stuff against the betas. We know the winter is going to be more feature development. The spring can be like paying down tech debt because we're kind of waiting for WWDC. And so we know that the spring is kind of like our free exploration time. We can do a lot of stuff then because there's nothing like pushing on us externally of what we have to do at that moment. So it does create this kind of cycle that we can rely on that is overall pretty knowable, pretty predictable, and certainly very doable.
How do you think Apple's doing in terms of bringing new features across these platforms? I mean, especially at the app level, things are kind of more intertwined than ever, and sometimes, kind of famously, the iPad may be a year behind the iPhone in some feature or capability. Do you think there's areas that Apple could improve there, or are you generally pretty happy with how they've been doing?
I guess my opinion on this has evolved over time. There are certain areas that Apple has always shown maybe shortcomings in, or maybe not enough priority. One of those, certainly, as you both know very well, is iPad power user features in general, whether it's multitasking or windowing features or things like the Files app slowly coming on. Like there's all sorts of like ways in which people have tried over time to push the iPad's boundaries in terms of software capabilities into more pro type uses. And Apple, as you know, has moved fairly slowly in that area. They do make moves, but they really take their sweet time. And it seems like the iPad is just not as high of a priority for them in terms of power user features as the other platforms. And so for a while, I would say, oh, they're neglecting this, or this has a problem, or they should be looking more at this. I've come to more accept it now and to realize that I should probably not care about a platform or a feature area in Apple's products more than they seem to. So, for instance, I've given up on HomePods because I as much as I love their sound, they have great sound for their size especially. But it seems like Apple doesn't really care about the HomePod, and so I've given up. I've moved on to Sonos stuff wherever I can. Like whenever it comes time to replace a HomePod, I get a Sonos thing instead for it, because Sonos cares a lot more about their speakers than Apple does, and that has served me well in general. Like I try to focus on, for Apple, I invest in what they are investing in. So I invest my time and attention in the platforms they care a lot about. For the most part, it's the iPhone. And then maybe a distant second might be the Mac. And then kind of everything else is kind of, scattered beneath that. And I find that this sounds kind of defeatist maybe, but I've actually found this to be a very healthy and productive way to live. Like, if I am investing only in things Apple seems to be investing in, I get the good features, I get the good benefits, I get the stability, I get the attention and the work going into the products and platforms I'm actually using. And I've learned to accept things like Apple's never going to care about the HomePod, so stop waiting for it. I accept things like the iPad is never going to fit my needs as a power user, so I stopped trying. And so for the most part, for the established platforms, I accept that the Apple Watch is always going to be a pretty limited application platform for developers and users, and that's fine. I like it for other reasons. So the only places that it seems to be kind of in play are in the newest platforms. So right now it's the Vision Pro. That's a big question mark of like, are they investing in the Vision Pro? That remains an open question, I think. And certainly, whether I should invest in it is a big question as well. Currently leaning towards no for now. We'll see where it goes. But for the most part, I have found a lot of success in generally trying to only invest myself in areas that Apple's investing themselves in.
Yeah, I had a similar realization around the iPad a few years ago, just looking at like the commercials and the advertising and how are they using it in the way they sell it. And you realize, oh yeah, I'm trying to do more than they want me to do with it. So why am I swimming against that current? And as soon as you like scale back your expectations, then you're fine,
Mm-hmm.
And the good news is the MacBook Air is an amazing computer and you can do almost anything on it, right? And it's about the same weight as an iPad. So it's even less heavy than an iPad with a keyboard. So you can start to scale your expectations. But the interesting point to me that you made was the Vision Pro, because I feel like that's different. I feel like that one is still an experiment for them. It's just so unlike Apple to make a public experiment. But like when you look at their capacity to make these things, it's never going to be a blockbuster product yet because they can't even make enough of them to make it a blockbuster product. I almost feel like they just put it out there to see what we do with it so they can start gauging what the future of it is.
I mean, maybe. I think that's what they had in mind, maybe, but it seems like first of all, it does not seem like they are supply constrained. I mean, I know that they have limited their release, but the fact is, ever since it launched, you've been able to go into a store and buy one that day.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and the rumors were that was not going to be the case, right? People were like, oh, it's going to take months to get one. And that just didn't pan out.
Yeah, and we all thought that. I thought we've all said that on our podcast. Like we all thought this whole year they'd be back ordered, they'd be hard to get, and the fact is they're not. I don't think they're reaching the sales targets that Apple might have had, or maybe they just had a massive supply built up. Who knows? But that seems unlikely. And I also think that Apple seemingly has been. I think Apple is expecting more developers and content makers to just jump on board on day one. And that also hasn't happened. That's been a much slower process there too. And I think what's odd about the Vision Pro is I don't think we've ever seen modern Apple release a product with seemingly so little follow through. And so all we're left to speculate on is like, is this incredible lack of follow through intentional? Was it planned this way? But no one's questioning whether or not it's been an incredible lack of follow through. That's been obvious, which is bizarre and I think to me disappointing, because I see the Vision Pro as having a lot of potential. Like it's a really cool technology, and there's a lot of tech in there, and I mean the amount of engineering and work they had to do to create that platform to even just be like just like, what I call like the empty desktop. Like when you just put it on and it's just, and you just see pass through. Just to do that was so much work. It's like a ridiculous amount of incredible engineering. And so I don't think this is an experiment that they, kind of feel lukewarm about. I think they put this out there thinking there would be a lot more interest in it than there actually has been. And what is going to be interesting about this is Apple, for a while, has not really had to work for their success in certain areas. Like, they've had so much buzz and so much success and so many great product releases in really powerful areas like the smartphone that they really haven't had to like work to attract developers or, negotiate with big content players and get big companies on board with their stuff. They could just rely on the fact that, look, we either already have sold 1 billion of these things or we're going to sell 1 billion of these things. So you're going to get on board. And we see that a lot of that in their, various attitudes towards developers and other companies. And with Vision Pro, that didn't work. They aren't selling a ton of them. Their sales prospects for it for the foreseeable future are not amazing. So the sheer numbers aren't going to be there to convince developers and big companies and content producers to jump on board with Apple and tolerate, the Apple attitude in certain ways. Like, the numbers aren't there to do that. So for this platform to succeed, Apple is going to have to dramatically change the way it interacts with developers and content owners. And I don't know that they have that in them, but I certainly think they didn't expect to have to do that. So this remains mostly a wait and see for me. I think the Vision Pro can succeed, but it's going to take a significant change in strategy, and we haven't yet seen any signs of that.
They're going to have to take the lead on content. I mean, I think, like you were saying earlier, they thought everybody would just jump on board, and they're not. So Apple's going to have to dip into those corporate coffers and make that content happen.
Mm-hmm.
The chicken and the egg. We need a lot more chicken here before the eggs are going to start showing up.
Right.
And that does make it a different thing than Apple's previous hardware, right? Like, thinking about something like the iPod, right? Apple didn't go out and buy a music studio, right? They partnered with music studios, and depending on who you are and what side of the deal you were on, that either went well for you or it didn't. But I'm also struck, not only does Apple need to get into the content game with this thing, is that those major content players aren't there. That Apple's friction with developers and other companies, I think, is hurting the Vision Pro when you don't have YouTube or Netflix or some of these other players there. And yeah, maybe it's because they weren't sure about investing in a new platform, but if they were buddy with Apple, they may have forgone those concerns and done it anyways. I just can't help but think that Apple's current stance on a bunch of different issues with a bunch of different companies is kind of coming home to roost here.
Oh, totally. I mean, I think we've seen that Apple is not really good at negotiation. The way Apple, quote, negotiates with people is by just having a giant stick. Like, and if they actually need to give a little or accept something being done in not quite their ideal way, they can't. Like, they just refuse. And so Apple only can, quote, negotiate when they have a massive upper hand that makes it so they don't really need to negotiate. They don't really need to compromise on anything. So what we see over and over again is, like, when Apple has to really, compromise on something, they don't do that, or they don't succeed in those areas. So that's, I think, going to be the problem with getting Vision Pro adoption is, like, what Apple needs to do to make this succeed is to make deals or incentives that will overcome the numbers for people. Because again, like, your market, if you're going to sell an app or try to sell content on the Vision Pro, the numbers of that market are going to be so small, you need some other reason to do it. Otherwise, it's not worth it. And you see this, like, what game consoles do. They will make deals with studios. They'll make deals with publishers. They will publish their own stuff to try to try to get a game console going off the ground before it has a lot of numbers to support it for third parties. The Vision Pro is going to have the same need. You look at what Facebook's doing with the Quest line. They do that. They go and commission things, or they make deals with publishers to bring their games over to the Quest line. Like, And that works. And that's what you have to do. Apple, again, has shown kind of no sustained good efforts to do that kind of thing. I don't think they can't do it. I do think they won't do it. So I do worry about the Vision Pro long term. I think one of the areas that they could go with it is, if you're looking at somebody who's going to bring content to it, the kind of people who would ignore the numbers are small developers who are just fans of it. Developers love developing for stuff that we have and use and love, even if there's not a lot of market for it. So, for instance, you look at things like Pico 8 development. That there is no market for that, but people do it because they just love it. You look at things like the Panic Playdate. The Playdate is a delight to use. It is a delightful platform. The market for it is pretty small compared to like other game consoles or iPhones, but people develop software for it. Why? Because they have it and they use it and they love it. So if we can get more developers to have, use, and love Vision Pros, we will get more software made for it. This isn't going to help so much with like big studio content. Like this isn't going to help more like large, 3D movie productions or whatever get made for it. But it could help the software side because I think they really need both ideally. And so if you want more software, get the Vision Pro in the hands of more developers. And to me, it largely comes down to money because most developers, especially like indies, I don't know a lot of indies who own Vision Pros because they're just too expensive. Most indies can't afford to drop almost $4,000 on a platform that will make them close to $0 in profit. But if you can get Vision Pros in more hands of those developers through some kind of discount or free purchase or something, some kind of like, developer purchase program, get these in the hands of developers at a steep discount, and many of those developers will find value in the platform, will start using it themselves, and will start developing for it merely because they have one. And that can start to, get some of those chickens growing.
One last quick Apple platform question for you. We talked a lot about the Vision Pro, which is a real treat, but I want to circle back a second to the iPhone. You mentioned at the top of the show, you're a Mac and iPhone person. I think most people, if they, were in some sort of weird situation where they can only have two Apple devices, it would be Mac and iPhone, right? I'm certainly that way. The others are secondary at best to those two. For a long time, Apple took criticism, I don't know if it was right or not, of being like the iPhone company, right? Their margins, their money was coming from the iPhone. It is the only thing out of like all their products that never seems to be late or very rarely seems to be late. There was a worldwide pandemic. We can forgive them for that 1 year with a weird release cycle. And we talked in that first section about the small iPhone and this rumored slim iPhone, which could change it up. But I kind of can't shake the feeling that Apple doesn't quite know what to do with the iPhone and at the 30,000 foot view. Right now we have the regular phone and the Pro phone, each in two sizes. The regular one and the big one, or if you're some people, if you're my wife, the big one and the huge one, right? They seem unwilling to sort of go after smaller markets for whatever reason. And when they do that with something like the iPhone SE, basically the lever they pull is expense, right? Like how do we make a cheaper iPhone? Well, usually that means using an old design, an older processor where margins are better. So I say all of that to sort of set the stage for this question of like, when you think about the iPhone long term, because a long time ago you said this, I think on ATP, and I think about it all the time. You said don't bet against the smartphone, right? And in a way, the iPad and the Vision Pro and even the watch are sort of little bets against the smartphone, and they end up sort of all falling in line behind it. Do you think that's going to continue? And do you think it's a fair criticism that Apple sometimes kind of takes swings and misses on what the iPhone actually is year to year? Do you think that's a problem? Or do you think this thing is here to rule the world for a long time?
I think they don't take enough risks with the iPhone. If you look at their other product lines, how many iPads are there? Way more than distinct iPhones. Mm-hmm. How many Macs are there? Not only are there way more Macs, but the Macs also span a ridiculous swing. Like you have 4 different laptops that are very different from each other. Plus like that weird 13-inch Pro that occasionally exists. Like then you have the desktops, which are wildly different from each other. Like you have like the iMac and then the Mac Mini and the Mac Pro and the Mac Studio. These are all like wildly different from each other. And the reason they do this is because they serve different needs. And they don't need every single Mac to be the blockbuster hit. You know, like whenever there's a new iPhone, size or whatever, the Mini certainly had this problem. The Plus currently has this problem where analysts will say this is the worst selling iPhone. Well, yeah, if you're only going to sell like 4 models, one of them is going to be the worst selling one. Does that actually mean it's a failure? No, it just means it's less of a success than the other ones. But like, what about like the 14-inch MacBook Pro? By most accounts, that is not the biggest seller in the MacBook Pro lineup or the MacBook lineup. Does that mean they should stop selling it? Probably not. It just means that the other ones are more popular. But the 14-inch MacBook Pro is a very popular, successful product in absolute terms.
Yeah, I love
the iPhone. Right. People love them. Like with the iPhone, I feel like they haven't taken enough risks. And part of that's, I'm sure there's lots of reasons, manufacturing efficiencies, scale, like I'm sure there's lots of reasons for that. The phone market is also a little bit different in that what people say they want or think they want oftentimes is different from what they actually end up buying. That we hear this a lot from people who know more about sales figures and stuff that like, people will say, I want a small phone, then they make a small phone and, most people end up still buying the bigger one. So there is certainly that factor to consider. But for the most part, I think it is totally fine for there to be multiple phones and for some of them to be really weird in different ways, like to be very small or very big, or to have different compromises, like the rumored slim one. Maybe that'll have worse cameras because you can't fit as good of a camera in a slim body, which in fact we see that like speaking of weird phones, the foldable phone market, Google just announced the Pixel 9 something fold, and the 9 Fold has worse cameras than the 9 Pro because the Fold body has to be thinner so that way when you fold it up, it's not as chunky as it could be. Well, the thinness of that body can only fit, kind of slightly worse cameras than the slab phone can. Well, what if Apple does that with the iPhone Slim? What if they, if the iPhone Slim comes out next year and it's a super slim phone, but in order to get that slim, they had to make the cameras a little bit worse? Let's try it. Why not? Let's see. Like maybe people will want that. Maybe the Slim will be so compelling in other ways, people will accept that trade-off. Who knows? I would love to see more experimentation from Apple in that way. What if, for instance, when you look at the size and scope of the iPhone business, it is so massive that just for sheer scale reasons, there are certain materials or components or manufacturing techniques they can't use because they can't make enough of them or they can't get enough of them. So if there's like some really awesome camera sensor, maybe there's an amazing camera sensor available, but if you put it in the iPhone, you got to make X million of them, and there just aren't that many available. Well, what if they introduced a higher end model that was really expensive, but had that amazing camera sensor that they could only, maybe they could only make 20 million of them in a year or whatever, and that would be a small, who knows? But like, there are certain things like that, or maybe they want to make an iPhone out of a different material, like ceramic, and they just can't make enough ceramic to fill the need for the entire iPhone line. But if it's one kind of accessory model off to the side, maybe they can make a special one that has a ceramic case or whatever. There are lots of opportunities like that for Apple to do interesting, fun things with the iPhone that don't need to be or that can't be the mainstream models. And in their other product lines, you have that. You have things like the 12.9-inch iPad Pro or the iPad Mini, both of which probably sell orders of magnitude less than the other iPad sizes. But they have those for those kind of fringes of the market that people nevertheless still like and value and will pay for. Yeah. Look at the desktops. First of all, they have desktops at all. Second of all,
they have a lot of them. It's kind of wild.
Right. And like you look at like the Mac Pro, I'm shocked the Mac Pro still exists, but it does. Even though they can't possibly be selling that many of them, but it exists and people are buying it. And then all the way down to like the Mac Mini, that also still exists. Like these products sell, and they sell to people who like, yes, if you didn't sell, like for instance, if the only Mac desktop was the Mac Studio, like kind of the middle one, like, okay, people would get by, we would figure it out. Some people would buy it, some people wouldn't. But thank God we have the other ones to solve other needs. right now with the iPhone, we don't have a lot of those extremes covered. We only have like the middle of the market covered. And it seems like if Apple tries to step out of that, everyone calls it a failure if it doesn't, destroy the sales of the other models. But I think that's just the wrong way to look at it. I would love to see more experimentation there. And that's part of the reason why the rumors of the iPhone 17 Slim, or whatever it'll be called, that's part of why those rumors excite me a little bit, because I want to see Apple do more weird bets with the iPhone. Like, try some weird stuff and see what sticks. I think that could be really fun.
Yeah, I mean, just looking up quickly, it looks like Apple sold 231 million iPhones in 2023.
Jeez.
If a mini or a Slim or a Super Pro was 5%, that's 11 million iPhones. How many companies would go nuts to sell 11 million products of anything?
Of anything, yeah.
Yeah, I just don't. And it is weird because you're right. On other product lines, they get it. I think that the analogy is the iPad. They have an iPad mini. They have multiple iPads to satisfy different needs. So many so that sometimes we make fun of them and say it's a confusing product line. But you know what? If you want an iPad, no matter how much money you want to spend, no matter what size you're looking for, you can get one. And the phone, for some reason, I don't know. I don't know. They must just be really obsessed with those margins. That's the only thing I can think of.
But they make such good margins on all of them. Like, it's not like they made less money on the iPhone Mini. Like, they made great money on that. Like, all their margins are great. And you see this with the Mac. Like, the Mac, all these kind of less popular Macs that exist on the fringes of that lineup, they still make a huge profit margin on them. So I think most people's reasoning when we try to analyze why Apple doesn't make more different iPhone models, I think most of our reasons do not hold up to scrutiny. We can say, well, maybe they don't want to manage the SKUs. They manage hundreds of SKUs. They're fine. Like, we say, like, maybe they won't make as much money. They'll make tons of money. Trust me. Like, they won't sell as well as the others. Well, it's still going to sell better than most phones in the market. Like, it's just, all these reasons don't really hold up to scrutiny. What it comes down to, I think, is they have just optimized. Like, they're hitting the middle of the market. There's not a ton of pressure for them to expand outward yet. So I think that's fine. What will be interesting is, like, in the rest of the cell phone market, we're starting to see some really interesting new ideas with things like foldables, which I think are going to be bigger than most Apple people think. Starting to see different experiments here and there. If any of those start having traction, like, again, I think the foldables thing has more traction than most Apple fans are willing to admit. If you ever talk to somebody who uses a foldable phone, they love it, because it's a phone that converts into a small tablet. They love it. So I think there is something there. And so maybe we'll start to see Apple kind of break out of its comfort zone in certain ways there, which I think will be better for the whole market. So, we'll see. But I do hope that they start pushing those walls. And again, that's why the 17 Slim rumors sound kind of fun to me.
Well, and I think the other big divider coming up is the mobile phone as your personal assistant. Like, if AI really gets legs and it really can, order a pizza for you and cancel your dentist appointment, if Apple is not right there with the rest of the industry, it doesn't matter how good the iPhones are, people will switch out.
Yeah, I think that's part of the reason why this new AI boom in phones is, I think, so potentially interesting, because it does have the potential to really shake stuff up if there's big competitive differences.
All right, well, Marco, thanks so much for coming back on the show. I always love hearing your opinion on stuff. You've got interesting thoughts as a power user, as an Apple. Can I call you an Apple fan? I think you are.
Yeah, I'm a fan.
You love their stuff, and but you're very attentive to what they're doing, and I really value your opinion. If people want to follow you, I guess they should definitely go over and check out the Accidental Tech podcast, your podcast that you do with Casey and John. That's at atp.fm, correct?
That's right. Yep.
Yeah. All right. Anywhere else people should go to keep up with what you're doing? Of course, go download Overcast, gang. It's awesome. Really love the update, by the way. I'm 100% in.
Thank you so much. I'll give you a little hint. I'm also trying to get swipes back on the Now Playing screen, but that might take a little bit longer.
Ooh.
Okay. Excellent.
We'll see.
Excellent.
We'll see. SwiftUI has not made that easy.
But see, that's what I love about it is, like, you are always making it better. And, some of the big boys don't put as much effort in as you do. So that's the apps I want. I want the apps from the developers that are never happy, and that's usually the best apps. So go check out Overcast, and that's also at overcast.fm if memory serves.
That's right. Yeah, ATP and Overcast. That's where to find me.
Okay, and we are the Mac Power Users. You can find us over at relay.fm/MPU. Thank you to our sponsors today. That's our friends over at 1Password, NetSuite, and ZocDoc. If you are a More Power User subscriber, stick around. We're going to talk more about Apple Intelligence with Marco. If you're not a subscriber, check it out. You get an ad-free extended version of the show. It really helps keep the lights on around here, and we'd appreciate it. Thanks a lot, everyone, and we'll see you next week.